Good morning and welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about while I've been working on this piece. And it's from something that Gary Vaynerchuk often talks about, which is, are you on the offense or are you on the defense? And I realize that for me, being on the offense is where I like to play. And it's actually had a huge impact on the success of my career so far. So stick around and we'll talk a little bit about it. You can decide whether you're on the offense or on the defense. And if you're on the defense, you might want to change that. So most of you know I'm a huge Gary Vaynerchuk fan. For those of you who don't know who he is, I recommend you Google him. Anyways, I follow him on YouTube. He's one of the very few people that I actually do follow. And he's always talking about being on the offense rather than the defense. And while I was working on this piece, I kind of was thinking about that a lot because this is a really good example of being on the offense. But first, before we kind of get into that, let's talk about kind of what that means. And I look at it at being on the defense means you look for the downside on taking certain actions, and then you use those as excuses to not do things. And I think a lot of people behave that way, not only in relation to their art in terms of taking risks, or fear of failure, but also just in life in general. Whereas being in the offense means, you focus on the upside and you're willing to risk the downside. And there's been actually a number of times in my life, and particularly in my art career, where being on the offense has paid huge rewards. And the very first one that comes to mind, obviously, is making the decision at 39 years of age to quit my career as a police officer after 18 years of being invested in that. I was a detective in the commercial crime squad in the Toronto Police Force. Very kind of plum position, making a very good living. I was halfway to retirement. I had a pension, and my wife and I made the decision that I was going to cash in my pension, take commuted value, quit my job, and pursue my art career. And for many people, that would be a scary thing. And it actually was a very scary thing for us. But we really focused on the upside, which was, what if I could turn this into a successful career and actually spend the rest of my life doing something I loved? And what if I could actually be more successful at this than I was as a police officer? Which has in fact turned out to be true. I make many times more what I would be making if I was still in the police force through my art. And it actually worked out that my wife Diane was able to retire at 49 years of age. So that's huge upside. But there also was a huge potential downside, which was, this might not work. And which for me would be really crushing, because it would be, the one thing about when you go after your dream, as long as you haven't kind of taken that reach at the gold ring, you can always tell yourself that one day I will, one day I will, one day I will. And there's that huge fear when you actually, take that swing or reach for the gold ring, that if you miss it, it's like, then you can no longer kid yourself about, I'm going to do this one day. So that was actually kind of one of the biggest fears that I had, was that just maybe I wasn't good enough. But I also thought, at the end of my life, I don't want to be sitting there thinking, what if I had done this? And the other, probably the more practical thing is, what if I couldn't do this, then how do I make a living? So the one thing about being on the offense is, you have to be aware of the downside and be willing to address it. So my wife had a very good job that was able to basically pay to look after the family on her salary alone. And we had an agreement that if this didn't turn out, I would go out and get another job. And the fact that I had been a detective in the fraud squad in the commercial crime unit meant that I had a set of skills that were very desirable in the corporate sector, so I could go and get another job making as much or even as more than I was as a police officer. But someone who was on the defense would have looked at all that and just said, no, I don't want to take that risk. And for me, I'm so glad I did, because what I had in mind in terms of what success might look like if I was successful is actually a fraction of what it actually has turned out to be. But there's been a number of other times in my career where that same sort of question presents itself about doing something and taking a chance, where if I'd have been on the defense, I never would have made that move. And one of those is just making that transition from painting portraits to landscape. I know many of you have heard the story of me and Neville Clark in our conversation, but there was a time when I was very, very well known as a portrait painter. I'd achieved kind of the highest honors you could in Canada as a portrait painter, but I was just sick of painting portraits. And I really, really wanted to paint landscape. And, I talked to a bunch of my friends about it, and they kind of advised me that, like portraits you're doing really well, you're making good money at this now, like I would continue painting the portraits because that's the safe bet, and just kind of, paint landscapes on your own as a hobby, until this conversation with Neville Clark, where he basically gave me a swift kick in the butt and said, if that's what you want to do, then you need to do it, and you need to throw yourself into it. Now, once again, I didn't totally kind of abandon my career to do that, because the downside there would be potentially like, what if nobody likes your work, or what if you're not very good at landscape? So what I did over a period of several years is I made specific time every week for me to work on my landscape work while still doing some portraits to bring in some money, until my landscapes got good enough that I basically just left portraits behind. And the very last commissioned portrait I did was the first painting where I ever was paid $5,000 for a painting. And that was the last portrait I did. Now, it took me another 4 or 5 years to get to the point where one of my landscapes would go for $4,000 or $5,000, but now they've gone way beyond that. And I get to get up every day and paint what I love, instead of, when I was painting portraits, painting what other people want me to paint in the way that they wanted me to paint it. And there's been a couple other instances of the offense and defense, and one of those is actually even just the point of having a website and putting my work out on the internet. So this is going back a number of years, but a lot of artist friends of mine made specific choices, a conscious choice not to have a website and not to put their work out on the internet. And the reason was they were afraid about their work being copied. And it's like, if you put it out there, then thousands of people can see it and people can copy it. And yes, that is a downside. The upside, though, is that your work can be exposed to so many more people and open up so many more opportunities. Well, for me, the downside actually happened. About 7 years ago, I got an email from Sterling Edwards, a buddy of mine, saying, you should check this out. I think this guy's copying you. And there was a painting on eBay that was definitely a copy of one of my works. I went to this artist's website and then was absolutely horrified to see that he'd copied over 100 of my paintings. So he hadn't just copied my style. These were copies of my paintings, and he was doing prints of his copies of my paintings. And so so that's like, yeah, the downside happened. It's like, oh my God. And obviously he'd been getting the images of my work from the internet. But there was a remedy for that. I mean, it wasn't pleasant, and I had a lot of sleepless nights, but I got a lawyer. We sued him. Basically, the situation was dealt with, settled out of court, but it cost him $35,000, $40,000 in legal bills. He had to pay all my legal fees. He also has like almost $500,000 suspended sentence hanging over his head if he ever copies my work again. And the pieces that he had done were destroyed. So it was dealt with. And so it's like, well, the bad thing happened, but the good thing that happened from the internet as well is the fact that, my work now is known around the world. Just last week, we shipped a Giclée to England, a Giclée to Germany, one to the United States, a couple to Ontario. I've had originals sell around the world, and all of that is possible because of the internet. And so it's like, yes, the downside is a real thing. And are more people going to copy me? Yeah. And am I going to deal with it when it happens? Yes. That same whole idea came up too with the whole idea of my YouTube channel. It's like, once that happened, that I realized my work was being copied, there was almost a tendency for me to go into a little shell and kind of like, okay, I'm shutting down my website. I'm not going through this again. But then I really had the desire to impart the knowledge that I've learned, the things that have allowed me to have a successful career, and the whole idea of having a YouTube channel. And I actually had this conversation with myself. It's like, people are going to copy my work anyways, because there are people out there with no ethics, no morals, and if they see something that's popular, then they're going to try and copy it and cash in on it. And if I'm going to create a YouTube channel showing people how I paint and explaining how I paint and explaining my process, then that's actually going to make it easier for those unethical people who are going to want to try to copy my work or even copy my style, which there's nothing you can do anything about. You can copy an individual copyright, but you can't copyright a style. And so then again, being on the defense would have just been saying, I'm not doing this channel because the potential for it to help those people who want to take advantage and rip me off, I'm basically showing them how to do it. But I decided to go on the offense, and what I thought of at that time is, if I put out such great content, and if I reach a very large audience, and if over time this channel becomes huge and it becomes so ubiquitous, and my work and my style becomes so ubiquitous, then if someone copies my work, it's much more likely that I'm going to find out about it, because so many other people now are aware of my work. And if people copy my style, it's like, well, rather than being upset about that, it's like, let's just assume that people do copy my style, and that I am the creator of a new style that people follow. Just like the Impressionists were, just like Picasso was, just like the first abstract expressionists are. And rather looking at it as a bad thing that people are trying to rip me off, look at it as a good thing, that you're having huge influence on the way other people go about creating their art. And this YouTube channel, I think, is, again, I'm enjoying it very much. The feedback that I'm getting from people out there who are artists who are trying to pursue their career, about how much they're enjoying this and how much they're learning, it's like, that's the upside. That's well worth the risk of the downside. So again, I'm just going to list a number of examples here, because I think this kind of is easier to understand when you see it anecdotally in terms of a narrative. But another thing that where this whole issue came up was the whole idea of doing reproductions. When I first started doing reproductions, I talked with a number of artist friends of mine. And so remember that this time I was on the board of the Canadian Society of Painters and Watercolor. So I was friends with a lot of artists who were very, very successful professional artists. And that whole idea of doing reproductions was a big question, because some artist friends of mine, said, well, the problem if you do reproductions, you're potentially going to lose out on some clients, because some clients don't want to buy work that's been reproduced, and you potentially limit the amount of public galleries or public museums that your work gets into, because they also typically don't want to carry works by artists who are published. And that's actually, for I think, a pretty greedy reason, that they also do prints of the works they have, and they don't want to take works where that's already been used up and the prints have already been sold. But even assuming that is a valid downside, I looked at it as though, well, for every person that doesn't want to buy a piece because it's been reproduced, I have met many people who are more interested in a piece that's been published, because they realize that, when you make the decision to publish a piece, you think it's special and it actually has a wider audience, and so that original to them is actually more valuable. And in terms of the public galleries or the public museums, it's like, that's not why I kind of wanted to do this. Will my work end up in public galleries and public museums, down the road long after I'm dead? I think probably. But if not, I'm okay with that. I wanted to become a successful artist because I wanted to be able to get up and come in the studio every day and paint. That's it. Whether there's any sort of awards or accolades or anything like that, even though I did kind of pursue those things early in my career in terms of going into juried shows and national competitions, all of that was just because I knew that would help me sell paintings, which would allow me to stay in my studio and paint. So the downside there, first of all, wasn't even a downside to me. But I know artists who have specifically not done prints because they're worried about that. But the upside has been huge. I mean, we routinely now do over 6 figures a year in earnings on the sale of giclées. And that, to me, is huge. That's actually something that I really want to increase, because if I'm only selling originals, I'm like a hamster on a wheel. It's like, yes, I'm making a good living, but the moment I stop painting or slow down, then the faucet gets shut off in terms of income coming in to support my family. Whereas with the giclées, that is what is going to allow me to kind of slow down on the hamster wheel and eventually step off it as the paintings continue to generate earnings long after the original's sold. And I'm going to get to this piece now again, talking about being on the offense. Once again, just like that conversation with Neville Clark, where artists, other friends were saying, well, what you're doing is, you're having a lot of success with it. You're getting sales. You should stick with that. The same sort of thing applies with my typical work. Like I still love my basic way that I paint, the normal way that I paint. And there's a huge audience for it. And I continue to kind of struggle to just keep up with the demand. Knock on wood. And the giclées are doing amazing. So the question is like, why would you now want to go and try and do a whole different style? And the answer is just because I want to see what's on the other side of that. I don't know where it's going to take me, but like, what is the downside? The downside is this painting maybe didn't turn out. And that's like, okay, then if it didn't turn out and I didn't really enjoy it, then it's like, okay, I've lost a couple weeks of work time. And is there an impact to this? That, yes, because that's a few paintings that I could have done that would generate earnings. But the upside is, what if I create something that is just as good or maybe even better than my typical work? And then where will that lead me? And I kind of feel that has happened here. This whole idea of this working in this style too was never an intent starting a couple of years ago. It was never like that I was bored with what I was doing. Initially, it was just I wanted to demonstrate what process looked like. So if you haven't seen my series on process on the channel, you should check it out. I think it's a 5-part series where basically you can see the birth, the germ of an idea for this style, and then I take it through and do about 4 or 5 paintings until the final one is the style has kind of somewhat gelled. But I still haven't had a lot of time to spend time playing in this style, and I've actually been looking forward to it for a year. I had a number of gallery shows in the last year that I had to finish up, and was really excited when the last one was done, just knowing, okay, I'm going to take all of my energy and focus it on doing the best studio piece that I can in this new current style. And it's kind of like, that's being on the offense, because what if it doesn't turn out? Well, that's a waste of time. Not only that, if I fail, I'm failing in front of an audience of people because the whole thing is being videotaped. But the upside is, what if it turns out spectacular? And what if people really like it? And what if that just opens up a whole other avenue where you may go with your painting? And I really think that's what's happened here. The more I look at this piece, the more I love it. The response that I've been getting from social media is over the top, with a number of people who were already big fans of mine saying that this is their favorite piece of mine that I've ever done. And so am I going to totally abandon my other style? No, I still love painting that way and will still continue to do it. But the beauty of this is when I get a little tired or bored, or if it just seems like, more of the same, I've got something else I can go to now that I think is going to be just as successful, if not more so. And this opens up a whole other audience potentially for me. While I'm really happy to see that my fans I've had up till now love this style as well, it's also generating a whole new group of followers who are more into the abstracted stylistic work and not so much into the representational side of things. So yes, I'm really, really glad that I risked the 2 weeks it took me to do this. And once again, that's being on the offense. So I would ask you to think about, are you playing life on the offense or are you playing life on the defense? Now, the one thing about when you play on the offense, you always have to identify what the downside is and protect yourself against it being a devastating downside. So you have to kind of temper this whole thing with practicality. But I think at the end of the day, most people, when they talk about regret, they regret the things they didn't do or they didn't try to do rather than regretting the things they tried and failed. Because the other thing too is once you try something and fail at it, you're only a failure if you quit. If you keep trying and eventually succeed, then you become a success. So anyways, I hope you have found this helpful. If you've never thought about this type of thing before, maybe you will, and maybe you'll decide to go on the offense. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, give me a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe, share it with your friends, and I welcome your comments and questions. I'm Tim Packer, and I thank you for your time.